Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bob Work. I was the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense, and as the Deputy Secretary, I became enmeshed in everything the Department of Defense was doing on artificial intelligence. After I left the department, I was lucky enough to be nominated by Senator Jack Reed to be on the National Security Commission for AI, where I had the honor and pleasure to serve as the co-chair with Eric Schmidt, who was elected by the commissioners to be our chair. To all of those of you who are here in the audience and those who are joining us online, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us for the launch event for Dr. Paul Scharre's second book, For Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Now, this is a very timely and very important subject. The United States and the People's Republic of China are now locked in a global rivalry that will likely determine the outcome of the great power competition between the two countries and shape the 21st century global system. Now, the competition is going to be waged on many levels: economic, military, technologically, culturally, politically. But the competition, the most important competition, as CIA Director Bill Burns said, technology and innovation are the main arena for competition and rivalry with China. Now, the Chinese think exactly the same way as Bill, with no less an authority than President Xi Jinping declaring, technological innovation has become the main battleground on the global playing field, and competition for tech dominance will grow unprecedentedly fierce. Now, the competition for tech dominance is going to span an awful lot of fields. There's quantum science, synthetic biology, 5G and advanced networking, energy systems, advanced manufacturing, robotics, and semiconductor. And that's just to name a few. But one field is going to stand above all others in terms of importance, and that is artificial intelligence. Now, as I said, Eric Schmidt, he was the chair of the National Security Commission on AI, and he recently wrote, it's a very good article in this month's edition, or the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs. And he says, AI supercharges the ability of scientists and engineers to discover ever more powerful technologies, fostering advances in AI itself as well as in other fields. That is because AI is generative in nature. By representing a platform for continuous scientific and technological innovation, it can lead to more innovation, and just speeding up the entire cycle of innovation. He goes on to say that rather than natural resource wealth or mastery of a given technology, the source of a country's power in the 21st century lies in its ability to continuously innovate. And because AI is the engine for continuous innovation, that's what puts it above the other fields in importance. So the country that dominates AI will thus likely become the #1, economic power in the world and the #1 military power in the world. And it will most likely use its power to try to influence and shape the global system in its own interests. Now, China is intent on being the #1 world power, has a plan to get there by 2049. Key to their strategy is to win the technological competition in AI by 2030. That is the foundation for their stepping stone to be the #1 global power. Now, when I was on the National Security Commission on AI, we were constantly being asked, who's ahead in this competition? Is it China or the United States? And it's very difficult to judge. Unlike in the Cold War, you'd fly over the Soviet Union with satellites, you count the number of ICBM silos, and you know exactly how many ICBMs the Soviet Union had. But now, everything is hidden in software. So you may not know who's ahead until you're actually in a fight. And you don't want to find out you're #2 when that happens. But anyway, what we did is we said, okay, in our view, AI is not a single piece of technology, hardware, or software. It's a constellation of technologies that we conceived of as a stack. And there were 6 components in this stack: data, hardware, algorithms, applications, talent, and integration. Now, after a large number of briefs by the intelligence community and everybody we could find, all the experts that we could find, we assessed that China has the lead in data, applications, and integration. And the United States has the lead at this point in hardware, algorithms, and talent. Now, in other words, 3 of the stack we judged the Chinese were either slightly ahead or ahead, and the United States had 3. So it's a very, very, very close race, and it could go either way. China wants to put us away by 2030, and the United States needs to respond to this challenge if it has any hope of winning the competition. Now, this is not a race we want China to win. We know exactly how the Chinese Communist Party would use AI. It will use it to surveil its own population, to suppress free thought and civil liberties, to monitor and suppress minorities. And it is offering its AI-driven population surveillance tools around the world, both to autocrats and other governments. So, as I said, we don't want China to win this race. And Eric Schmidt went on to say, at stake is nothing less than the future of free societies, open markets, democratic government, and the broader world order. So these are stakes that should, be important to every single citizen, because we don't want to have a world where autocracy is the standard method of government. And it is precisely for this reason that Paul's 4 Battlegrounds is such an important contribution to the ongoing debate, a very vibrant debate, over the future of AI in this country and in the world. It explains the importance of the AI competition, how it is likely to shape geopolitics, economics, and politics in the 21st century, and the great stakes of the competition. It's a call to arms to win this competition, and should be read, in my view, by every strategist, every member of Congress, and every senior leader in the Department of Defense. And I think you all know it is written by one of the very top experts in the field of AI. Paul is currently the Vice President, Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security. His first book, Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War, had an enormous influence inside the Department of Defense, and I think more broadly, in Europe, for example. It won the 2019 Colby Award. It was one of Bill Gates' top 5 books of 2018 and one of The Economist's top 5 books to understand modern warfare. Unfortunately, Oprah didn't pick it. Well, that was her oversight. Now, Dr. Scharre formerly worked as a policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, both in the Bush and the Obama administrations. He was, if not the primary pin, he was the force behind DoD Instruction 3000.09, which talks about autonomy in weapon systems and lays out the policy for the Department of Defense on how to pursue those type of weapons and capabilities. He holds a PhD in war studies from King's College London, and he's a former Army Ranger with multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So he can apply AI to the battlefield, to the Department of Defense, and to the federal government writ large, as well as with our allies. Now, moderating today's discussion is Jean Whaler, global business reporter for the Washington Post. Hi, Jean. She joined the Post in 2018 after 19 years at the Wall Street Journal, and she reported from New York, London, and Moscow. She has also written for Financial Times and the Moscow Times, which we will not hold against her today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jean and Paul to talk more about 4 Battlegrounds. Again, I'd like to welcome you all here, and those of you who joined us online. and I hope you have an enjoyable afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to say hello to our online audience as well. I guess the camera's over there. So online audience, if you'd like to ask a question at some point, please use the chat box on cnas.org/live, or use hashtag CNAS 2023 on Twitter. Be sure to identify yourselves, please, because we cannot accept anonymous questions. So we'll have about a 20-minute chat, and then we'll get to questions from the online and the in-person audience as well. All right, well, let's begin. I think it can often be helpful if we start with just a few definitions for complex topics. I'm not sure how familiar everyone in the room is with AI, and we've heard about it a lot recently with ChatGPT and all of these things, but what is AI? What's a quick definition?
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks, Gene, and thanks, Bob, for that great introduction. And thank you all for coming, and for those online as well. Certainly, AI is having a moment with things like ChatGPT. It had over 1 million users in the first 5 days online. And so that's one of the really cool things about ChatGPT is when I'm often talking with people, they have a chance to interact with it. And you can actually interact with these systems and then get a feel for when we say AI, what do we mean? The term that's often used is narrow artificial intelligence to describe the systems we're interacting with today. Because their intelligence is often very capable for things like writing text that ChatGPT does, or playing games like AlphaGo, playing the game Go, or playing poker, for example. But they are, of course, also very limited. And none of these systems have the generality that human intelligence has. And we can see with things like ChatGPT then on display, where oftentimes it'll do some weird stuff, or people are able to trick the system in clever ways. And that is, of course, a big limitation. And it's a problem for these AI systems in a national security context, when people are going to want to take advantage of them.
Gotcha. And we'll get to the 4 battlegrounds, defining those in a minute. But I wanted to maybe start with a colorful opening that you have in the book that's very gripping, where you talk about a virtual dogfight where an AI pilot on a screen, not in real life, just completely crushes the best F-16 pilot in the US military, or one of. And it's not even a close contest. It's just an immediate victory for the bot. How did that happen, and why did the AI pilot win?
Yeah, thanks. So I opened the book with this really interesting scene from the Alpha Dogfight competitions at DARPA a few years ago. And DARPA did this competition where they bring forward a bunch of different competitors. The winner among all of the different companies was a previously largely unheard of company called Heron Systems, beat out Lockheed in the finals, and then went head-to-head against a human. I don't know if he was the best pilot at the Air Force, but he might say he is, like many pilots, possibly. So went head-to-head in a simulator, so a lot of caveats apply in a simulator. But yeah, totally destroyed the pilot, 12-0. Pilot didn't get a single shot off. And one of the things that the AI did that was really quite interesting is it made these shots that are basically impossible for humans to make. So when the aircraft are circling each other, there's a split second where they're head-to-head, and there's an opportunity to these head-to-head gunshots, what pilots call forward quarter gunshots. They're banned in training by humans because there's a risk of collision as the aircraft are racing at each other hundreds of miles an hour. And if the pilot is trying to figure out how to get this shot off, it's very difficult to make, and then there's a risk that they actually might cause a collision. Well, not a problem for the AI. It can do both things at the same time. It can make these these shots with superhuman levels of precision. And the really wild thing is it learned to do this all on its own. So it wasn't actually trained to do this. The AI just learned to do this by interacting in the simulator. And in total, the AI actually had 30 years of simulated flight time before this competition. And so it's a really interesting example of ways that AIs can not just be better than people, but can actually do things differently.
Yeah. And how might the military use an AI pilot in the future? I think you make the point that we're not going to see humans leave the cockpit anytime soon. These might just be assistants. Why is that? How could they be useful? Yeah, well, we certainly obviously have lots of drone aircraft today, and the military is developing more of them. But for this particular system, DARPA's vision is not actually to try to completely replace people, but to try to build an AI system that can offload a variety of different human tasks
from what the human is doing, and in particular offload dogfighting so that the human can then be thinking about higher level mission tasks. And the maneuvering, the things that actually we could get a machine to do probably better than people are the things that we hand over to the machines. And while this was in a simulator just recently, in December, actually DARPA started using these AI algorithms in an F-16 in real-world flights.
Really? Wow. And how do the human pilots feel about that? Do you know? You might not know, but do they resent this, or do they feel like their days are numbered, or?
And the pilots I talked to varies considerably. I think the biggest thing is that people in the military want systems that are effective. If they work, they want to use them, but there's a barrier of trust. And oftentimes justifiably, for people who've interacted with a lot of AI systems, again, ChatGPT is one you can interact with and see this, oftentimes it's worth being skeptical. So actually part of this DARPA project is measuring pilot trust. And so they have sensors in the cockpit looking at what is the pilot doing. So for example, if the AI is in control and the pilot's supposed to be looking at this higher level mission task and what is the other aircraft, but they're looking at the controls, that's a sign that maybe they don't fully trust what the AI is doing. Or of course, if they turn the AI off and take control, which they can't do still, that's a sign maybe they're not trusting it. So how do we get to, trust, but also trustworthy systems, which is a big barrier to clear?
Right. Okay, let's define quickly the 4 battlegrounds. What are they? These are the 4 battlegrounds on which basically the US and China are competing for AI power, right? What are the 4 battlegrounds, and how well are we doing versus China on each of them?
Sure. So Bob walked through, I think, one way of kind of slicing and dicing this competition in his opening remarks. There have been a number of different indices that different organizations have built looking at metrics of AI power in the US and China and Europe. What I ultimately focused on was the 4 battlegrounds of data, computing hardware or compute, human talent, and institutions, the organizations that are needed to adopt AI technology, like, for example, DARPA doing this competition. And what I conclude is that China's alleged advantage in data is, I think, actually overstated. That often comes up in competitions that, well, China has an advantage because they can surveil their population and they have a larger population. I think for a number of reasons that's probably not true. It's a pretty level playing field there. But in talent and in the hardware domain, the US has huge advantages over China. And we've certainly seen this on the export control side with the Biden administration's recent export controls on semiconductor technology to China, that between the US, Japan, and the Netherlands, they control 90% of the market for semiconductor manufacturing technology. So it's a huge edge in hardware. And then in talent, the US is the destination of choice for AI scientists from around the world. And that is an advantage China simply cannot compete with. The best AI scientists in the world, they want to come to America, including those from China, actually come to the US and they tend to stay here in the United States, which is a major advantage in this competition.
And then institutions are the 4th, right? Did we already talk about that, or?
No.
Okay.
No. So,
yep.
So in institutions, it's really, in many ways, a dead even competition where, you need institutions to take all of these raw inputs of data and computing hardware and talent and turn them into useful applications. And the DARPA dogfight competition is one example, but there are others. The DoD's had this huge explosion of new innovation organizations in the last 6 or 7 years. Organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit, DoD's outpost out in Silicon Valley. Well, China's doing the exact same thing. So there is a Chinese version of DIU. It's actually called in China, people refer to it as China's DIU, that the PLA created not long after the US created DIU. So there's this competition to basically take this technology that's coming out of the commercial sector and spin it into the military and find useful applications for the military that both the US and China are going to have access to AI technology. And the US is going to have to find ways to use AI better if we're going to succeed in this competition.
When would you say that the US military really got serious about AI? How serious is it now? And how well is it working with these outside tech companies that are inventing a lot of this technology?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, frankly, the U.S. military is not serious about AI now. So I would hope that the answer is 2023.
Yeah.
But I mean, we'll see. I think there's this huge gap within the Defense Department between the rhetoric and then when you look at actually what DoD is doing in AI. It really doesn't compare. So when he was Secretary of Defense, for example, Mark Esper testified for Congress that AI was his #1 priority. Which, if you look at what DoD is spending money on, like, no, it's not. It's not even close.
What was at the top?
Well, the F-35, of course.
Okay.
Right? It's the largest defense program by far. And if you look at DoD spending, so DoD doesn't have a public estimate for their spending on AI. It's tricky because it gets down to like how do you define AI, and it's a hard thing to measure. But the best independent estimates, Bloomberg Government's done a really good one, estimates that DoD spending on AI is about 1% of the defense budget. So that's not only like your top priority, that's not a priority at all at 1% of defense spending. And I think DoD is going to have to step that up if the U.S. is going to stay competitive in AI.
And you spend a lot of time in the book talking about DoD's relationships with Silicon Valley and startups. And you mentioned that initially that was quite a controversial and adversarial relationship, and DoD has worked to try to improve it. What is the state of that relationship now, and how well is DoD kind of integrating technology from the outside tech world?
Yeah, there was a real, I think it's a panic in Washington when Google decided not to continue their work on Project Maven. And there was a lot of fear that DoD would be locked out.
Which was what? Maybe briefly describe what was Project Maven.
Right, yeah, great. So Project Maven was DoD's first major project using deep learning for image classification. So just 5 years ago now, founded by Bob Work when he was Deputy Secretary, really focusing the department's attention on AI and all of the progress that we've seen coming out of the deep learning revolution, using AI for image classification, which by now is a very, very mature technology, basically taking labeled images, training a machine learning model on them, and then using them to process, in this case, images from drone video feeds to help manage all of the information we're getting off of drones.
Houses, buildings, trees, whatever.
Exactly, identifying. And this is now so, so DoD's first deployment's 5 years old, but the technology is so widely available. We've actually seen it used on Ukrainian drones using commercial technology in the war in Ukraine. So it's pretty widely accessible today. And when Google said they weren't going to continue work on this, there was just this, I think, real concern in the defense community that the DoD wouldn't be able to compete, that tech companies would say they don't want to work with the US military, and that wouldn't be the case inside China. And certainly we're not going to see like major Chinese tech companies writing open letters against the Chinese Communist Party. That's going to land you in jail to do that. But the reality is we've seen this huge explosion of defense-oriented AI startups. And I had a chance to interview with many of them in the book and do site visits. And they're doing really innovative things. And in fact, the biggest barrier that I saw was on the DoD side in terms of contracting and acquisitions. I think a good example of this is like the Jedi Cloud Computing contract, where the barrier wasn't actually that companies wanted to work with the DoD. In fact, they were suing the government over who got to work with the DoD. The problem was this system that the government has put in place that allow companies to file lawsuits and protests and gum up the works. That's really slowing up defense innovation.
Gotcha. So we often think about killer robots when we think about AI and warfare, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. But actually, you make the point in the book that a lot of the near-term uses will be a lot more mundane, kind of back-office things like logistics or predicting when aircraft need to be repaired. And you call these things the real meat and potatoes of military power. Tell me a little bit about those uses. Are they already being used for those purposes, and what is the potential benefit there?
Yeah, so certainly the battlefield uses get the most attention, and they're certainly quite, I think, likely to be very transformative on the battlefield. But of course, most of what the military does is moving people and things from one point to another, keeping track of them. It's logistics and personnel management and finance. On a day-to-day basis, it probably looks a lot like what Walmart or Amazon do. It's what happens at the end that's different. And there's huge, so there's huge advantages there for militaries, right? So if militaries could make their logistics just a few % better, or their maintenance operations, that's going to have huge effects on the battlefield. I mean, we're seeing, in fact, this play out in Ukraine, where we can see very dramatically the importance of things like logistics or maintenance. And that's been some of the applications that DoD's gone after with AI. One of the very early applications was looking at predictive maintenance. So the idea being, if you could get enough data about maintenance and, say, performance of an aircraft or helicopter, could put that into a machine learning model and then predict when a part's going to fail, and that could allow you to both save money, and there's billions of dollars potentially at stake for the Defense Department, or increase your operational availability rates. So basically the reduce the amount of downtime that your aircraft or other vehicles have where they're out for maintenance. And that's also potentially really transformative when you think about making these very expensive weapon systems more available. So that's just one application. When I spoke with people at the Joint AI Center or other parts of the DoD on their applications, they were a whole wide range of things. So the Army AI Task Force, then up at Carnegie Mellon, was looking at, for example, data of West Point cadets, and rather than having the top performing cadets simply sort of pick what branch they wanted to take in the Army, looking at the performance of past cadets and where they went, and trying to figure out, could we have an algorithm say, well, we think you're going to be most successful in this branch, in the Signal Corps, or engineers, or infantry, or armor. Is there data you could use to do that? Or another part of the Joint AI Center, looking at taking a language processing model, kind of like ChatGPT, just to understand all of the DoD issuances and instructions and directives that the DoD has, which are massive. And then,
thousands a year, you said, I think, right?
What's that?
There are thousands of these things a year that DoD issues.
It's unbelievable, right? And so to have some kind of AI tool to help you sift through them and understand how are they connected to one another, if you update one, what are the other things that you need to change, could potentially be really valuable for DoD.
Gotcha. You mentioned JAIC there. What is that exactly?
So the Joint AI Center, God rest his soul, it's moved on.
Oh, it has, sorry.
Been folded into the Chief Digital AI Office in DoD. But one of the things that's really important is this pattern of institutional innovation that DoD has been quite active in. And so one of the early attempts to the DoD kind of wrap its arms around AI was the creation of the Joint AI Center. Had the opportunity to interview with lots of people actually across the center. Then head of the center, Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, was wonderful in opening up doors within the Joint AI Center. And then we talked to some of their team and had the chance to talk to some of the people on the ground in creating it, some of the bureaucratic battles to get it underway, some of the antibodies that came out within the bureaucracy against the Joint AI Center. And so I think it's a good example of how the DoD is continuing to find ways to innovate, not just with the technology, but also with the organizations that we need to be successful using AI.
You talk a little bit in the book about how AI systems don't just think better or faster than humans, that they think in an entirely different way. Talk a little bit about that, maybe describe what we've seen in the way they play games, chess and Go, and how could that translate onto the battlefield?
Yeah, so this is one of the most fun things for me in researching the book is you've had all these breakthroughs in different games, right? So chess and Go and poker and StarCraft and Dota 2, and they've reached superhuman performance. And I was really interested in how do they play differently than people, and are there commonalities in how they play across all of these different games? And the answer is yes, there are, which is super fascinating, because many of these are very, very different. They use different ways of using AI to play these games. And so some of them are things like the AI systems, some of the things that you would expect, like the AI systems often have superhuman levels of precision and accuracy, which is expected. So for example, in some of these computer games like Dota 2, there is different agents that are fighting on the simulated battlefield. The AI systems can use precisely the right amount of attack to kill their opponent without using too much energy in these attacks. They can even do this in coordinated team attacks. In fact, they're quite good at this, much, much better than people, where they can have their attacks land at precisely the same time when they're attacking an enemy player. But we've also seen other things that are in some ways are even more interesting. So for example, in chess and Go, the AI systems do a better job than humans at playing across the entire board, including doing things like multi-axis attacks across the board in chess. They often will make moves that at the time don't seem very valuable, but they're playing for position in a way that turns out to be really advantageous later down the road. So they've engaged in better long-term planning in some of these games. So there's a whole set of different advantages that are quite interesting, and I think potentially hold a lot of potential for how militaries think about using AI in warfare.
And what are some of the ways that they could be different on the battlefield? Like you mentioned swarms in the book, swarming. What is a swarm, and how would it work? How would AI systems swarm, and how would a human commander attempt to control a swarm or interact with it.
Yeah, so the really interesting thing about these games is that in all of these games, whether it's chess or Go or these computer games, the AI systems have access to the same units as people do. So when we think about AI, we're often thinking about robotics, and people think about, well, what are the neat things we could do with robotics, which there's a lot. But the essence of what AI are doing in these gaming environments is what the militaries would call command and control. It's in the information processing and decision making. And so swarming is really interesting in terms of changing the command and control paradigm from today's hierarchical structures where you have teams and squads and platoons and companies and so on, to a very different way of commanding military units. With the idea being that you might have large numbers of robotic systems, could be tens, hundreds, thousands of them, that the human is giving the direction to the swarm as a group. And then these robotic agents are autonomously deciding how to carry out the task. And they're all coordinating with each other in a way that's not possible for people to do at that scale. So if you look at, for example, like sports, sports have a range of players on the field or the, whatever they're playing on, of anywhere from like 5 to maybe 12. I think it's Australian rugby is like an outlier, like 18, but that's kind of rare. Because when you get to large numbers beyond that, people can't coordinate with each other, right? So if you had 100 people running around a soccer field, playing against another 100 people, it'd just be pure chaos with say, like 50 soccer balls on the field, right? Humans can't process that much information, but AI systems could do that. And so that opens up really interesting new paradigms for thinking about command and control in warfare.
And this would be thousands of individual actual robots, physical robots, like drones?
Could be drones, could be munitions, could be intelligent sensors that are sharing information, and then the idea being that you have these distributed autonomous robotic agents, they're cooperative, and they're reacting to things on the battlefield, at the battlefield's edge, at the speed of combat.
Are we certain that humans will always be able to maintain control of something like that? I mean, you get in the book you talk about the idea of the battlefield singularity. What is that, and who is worried about that? Who's talking about it these days?
I mean, I'm worried about it.
Okay.
So this concept of a singularity in the battlefield has been advocated by some Chinese military scholars who are writing about AI, who hypothesized that at some point in time in the future, and I don't think this is a near-term thing, but maybe several decades down the road, when we see things like swarming and AI fully integrated into military operations, there could be some change where the pace of combat action eclipses humans' ability to understand. And the action on the battlefield is moving faster than humans can keep up, and we basically have to turn over the keys to machines in order for militaries to remain effective. And I think that is a troubling prospect, because then it does raise these questions about how do we ensure that humans are in control of warfare? How do we manage escalation? How do we manage war termination when you've simply handed over control to the machines and you have to let the machines fight at machine speed? How do you find a way to halt them? So I think that's a troubling prospect. I don't think it's a near-term one, but I think there's a real need to start thinking through some of these challenges now.
And that's something that you get into toward the end of the book, kind of some more philosophical questions about where this could all lead. And you even quote former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis speaking about how AI could potentially change I think you say, the nature of war itself. Someone asked him about it, and he said, quote, "I'm certainly questioning my original premise that the fundamental nature of war will not change. You've got to question that now. I just don't have the answers yet." So I guess all along, people in the military of experts have always taken it as sacred that the nature of war will not change, right? What does that mean, the nature of war, and why has AI started people thinking about maybe that could change?
Yeah, and almost like sacred is probably almost the right word, because it's like this article of faith among defense intellectuals that the nature of war doesn't change. So I sort of like commit heresy here, but I'm in good company because Secretary Mattis said the same thing. And so the way that defense thinkers tend to think about this is that the character of warfare is constantly changing, the way that militaries fight. And you can see this on the battlefield. In Ukraine, for example, even the tactics that both sides are using are constantly evolving in response to each other. But this idea is that the nature of war itself, what is war as a human activity, is unchanging, and there are these timeless elements of war, the chaos and violence and confusion on the battlefield. The human psychological aspects of war are that which are the same today as they were 1,000 years ago. And so the idea is, well, is that always going to be the case? And in fact, further down the road, I don't think this is a near-term thing. I don't even think that swarms get you there. But maybe several decades from now, could AI change the nature of war itself? If we now actually introduce this non-human form of intelligence on the battlefield that is processing information that isn't affected by the human psychology that does affect warfare. And I think you can see glimmers of this in some of these gaming environments that I talked about. So for example, one of the things that some of the people competing against AI agents in these games have talked about is the AI agents are giving in superhuman levels of aggressiveness. So for example, in games like StarCraft or Dota 2, you have these battles playing out in these simulated environments in real time. And when humans are playing it, even the top professional gamers, and they spend a lot of time playing these games, there'll still be lulls in the action, right? So they still have to focus their attention. The human does somewhere else when they pivot to another part of the battle. AI doesn't have to do that. And so the humans have talked about feeling pressured constantly when the AI is always on the attack. And we see this in, of course, real-world combat where the enemy needs to sleep. They need to rest also. Humans get tired in warfare. They get emotionally exhausted. And none of those human psychological aspects of war would exist for AI. And so I think you could envision a far future where that begins to change the nature of war itself.
Meaning all of the human elements to it are gone, and therefore it is what? It is just a battle of machines that ends how, or is motivated by what?
Well, those are some of the questions, right? It's like, what is that then? Is it war? Is it something like war that is something different? In some cases, you could envision things like a advanced piece of malware, a cyber system that maybe there's an accident or it expands beyond its intended target and is wreaking havoc. So what would you call that, right? Is it an industrial accident? Is it warfare against some non-human organization? What would that be?
Right.
It begins to raise some interesting questions.
And just to maybe go back to reality a little bit more, and there's a lot of reality in your book. You make the point over and over again that these things are very far in the future, that some of the AI tests being carried out today don't work. There's a passage about AI piloted drones that crash and can't navigate an obstacle course. But the war that we see in front of us today is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that, I'm far from a military expert, but seems to be being fought on the basis of very old, or at least tried and true tactics, tanks, dumb bombs, dumb missiles. Does that give us a little more pause about what AI might bring to, is AI for the moment kind of overhyped if we're not seeing it on display in the Russian invasion, or is it at work there?
Well, in a marginal way, right? So I think the key takeaway, at least for me, of the war in Ukraine is the importance of all of the non-material factors in war. That in fact it's not a war of whiz-bang technology, of AI, and there are drones being used, but I don't think it's a decisive use in the conflict. Certainly cyber tools, for example, have been relatively marginal in terms of their effectiveness. And in fact, we're seeing on display all of the human elements of warfare, of the importance of morale and will to fight, of unit cohesion, and the asymmetry between Ukraine and Russia, for example, on the battlefield, and the human element is really very stark. And even the technology that is being used, in some ways, it's like World War I era conflict, right? It's trench warfare, and infantry, and artillery. And so it's an important reminder. It is to some extent, sort of a little bit of a splash of cold water on a lot of the technological hype. To think about the importance of the human element in warfare and in other domains.
I think we're going to go to some questions from the online audience and the in-person audience. In-person people, if you could wait for the mic to get to you, I guess I'll call on you and the mic runner will come to you, and just please introduce yourselves. I will start first with a question from Patrick. China's party state obstructs generative AI because it fears what it might create. But how much does the CCP's need to retain political control impede the PLA military innovation with AI? Did you catch that?
I did, okay. Yes. That's actually a great question. But let me explain maybe, like at least generative AI. So one of the things that was really amazing in terms of AI advances in 2022 was all this progress in generative AI, which is AI used to generate different forms of media. Could be text, like ChatGPT or other large language models, or AI art generators, for example. They're generating all sorts of interesting different artwork. Well, in China, the Chinese Communist Party has been very wary of a lot of these tools. They've actually been very forward-leaning in terms of regulating synthetic media, AI-generated media, and there's a tremendous amount of excitement inside China about ChatGPT. I've heard from counterparts that we talk with in China that there's so much excitement about it. Certainly there's been a tremendous amount of articles written within China about sort of this frenzy over ChatGPT. But one of the things about these large language models is they tend to say kind of weird off-script things. It's a little bit hard to control what they're going to say. And so a major sort of concern that companies have to navigate in China is the censorship of the Chinese information environment. And this is not entirely new. So there was an incident a couple of years ago where Microsoft had a bot inside China called Xiaoice. And in response to a question of what is your Chinese dream, that's a term that Xi Jinping uses, it said, my Chinese dream is to go to America. That did not go over well. It got promptly pulled offline. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Chinese companies navigate this. But you know, at the end of the day, the PLA has access to top-tier AI companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, SenseTime, iFlyTech. They maintain close ties with the government. You know, I think the PLA is going to have access to ultimately enough AI companies to do whatever they want to do with AI. And it's going to be really the challenge in importing this technology from the commercial space and then finding ways to innovate it, which they are certainly working on as well.
I had a question from the room here. Maybe in the back there, the fellow raising his hand. Just please introduce yourselves, everyone.
Hi, Scharre Zuffer, formerly IC, NSC, and State, currently at Meta. This is a terrific event. Looking forward to reading the book. Secretary Rourke talked about winning, that we can't lose. We have to. What does winning look like? How do you know we've won?
Did you make that out?
Yes.
You're a little muffled. Okay,
Yeah,
you did. Okay.
What does winning look like? How do we know that we've won? So I think if you think about AI as like another industrial revolution, as a general purpose technology like electricity or the internal combustion engine, I think we can see a historical example of what winning and losing looks like, which is during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Great Britain and Germany were ahead of other countries in industrializing, and they raced ahead in terms of economic productivity and then therefore military power. And Russia lagged behind industrialization and fell behind them. And by the end of the 19th century, Great Britain and Germany had eclipsed Russia in terms of economic and then military power. So I think, you know, deep down our fear here is that we're going to be Russia and China's going to overtake us. And so I think winning involves, you know, finding ways to adopt this technology, to keep the US at the forefront of AI development, and then adoption and using AI technology for economic growth in a whole variety of different industries across the United States, in medicine, in finance, in transportation, and other areas, and then for national security applications as well, in intelligence, in the military, to stay ahead of other countries.
Another one from the room. Maybe we'll go to this fellow right here in the front.
Hi, Ron Kiesing from Leidos. I wanted to ask, you know, the Stanford University Human-Centered AI group has talked about this concept of foundational models and foundation models, models that are so widely used they become kind of a foundation for the field. And especially in this age where advances in the latest generation of these generative AI models seems to depend so much on size, and the Chinese are clearly racing to build the largest generative models in competition with us. What are your thoughts? Do you think that we will see a future where AI power and the control of these large language models, or just largest models, will become concentrated in a few hands?
I think we're already seeing that now, actually. So the trend in AI has been towards increased scale in the most cutting edge and advanced systems. We're seeing this huge explosion in the size of these AI models and then the data sets and the computing hardware that are used to train them. So for example, these large language models or foundation models, sometimes called like ChatGPT, will use hundreds of gigabytes of text, and they are trained on thousands of specialized chips, graphics processing units, or GPUs, running in sometimes for weeks at a time. And the pace of growth here is really phenomenal. So since 2010, the amount of computing power that's being used in these cutting-edge machine learning applications like ChatGPT has increased 10 billion-fold. That blows me away. I can't think of any other technology area that's growing that rapidly. And it's doubling. The amount of computing power that's used in these applications is doubling every 6 months, which is much, much faster than Moore's law doubling every 24 months. Now, for the largest models, it's like ever so slightly slower. It's every 10 months, but it's still an incredible pace of growth. When you think about other areas of technological competition, missiles are not 10 billion times faster than they were 12 years ago. And so how does the DoD, how does the US compete in this space? Well, what we're seeing is this transition really towards these very compute-intensive, very large models. And what it's doing right now is it's locking academics out of competing at this frontier of AI research. So we're seeing companies like Meta, Microsoft, Google competing at the leading edge, but academics don't have the money to compete, to spend for thousands of GPUs doing all of this training. Now, one of the things that the US government's talked about is creating this national AI research resource. And in fact, the Stanford group was really instrumental in pioneering this, getting it on the attention of the US government. It's not yet funded, but the group behind it, the task force, recently just wrapped up their final report. I'm very hopeful that Congress will actually fund this because I think it's essential if the US is going to stay competitive in this compute-intensive era that we're entering.
A question from online from Mark. Both the 6-layer stack and the 4 battlegrounds combine chip design and the building of the chip. As Taiwan and Korea are the only places that can build these chips, does that create an imperative to enhance our defense of Taiwan or convince TSMC to build leading-edge systems here?
Yes and yes. So if you look at any of these battlegrounds, right, you can certainly unpack them and they go a bit deeper. And so on the hardware side, there's this really interesting dynamic where the semiconductor ecosystem is highly globalized, but it's also concentrated in these key choke points in just a few companies and countries. And so you have a couple countries that are, turns out, really central in this hardware competition, and some of them are somewhat surprising. So on the technology side, it's the US and Japan and the Netherlands that control 90% of the manufacturing equipment that's used to make chips. And in fact, in some cases, there's just a single company that controls key elements of this. So the Dutch company ASML has a monopoly on the extreme ultraviolet lithography that's used to make the most advanced chips. And then on the manufacturing side, Taiwan turns out to be this critical player in the manufacturing side, where 90% of the most advanced chips in the world are made in Taiwan. So statements like China is the Saudi Arabia of data turns out to be like not totally valid when you look into it, but it's probably not a stretch to say that Taiwan is the Saudi Arabia of computing hardware. And that's a real problem when we have the fact that, the Chinese Communist Party has made quite clear that they want to absorb Taiwan by force if necessary. And obviously, it's already a geopolitical flashpoint. And so I think both that, Taiwan's central role in the global economy as this technology leader is yet another reason to make the defense of Taiwan exceptionally important to US and global interests. But also, this is a good reason to look for ways to diversify semiconductor manufacturing, and so that it's not so heavily concentrated in this one geopolitical flashpoint.
Question in the room, how about? Back in the back there, please.
Hey, Paul. Jerry Hendricks with Sagamore Institute now. So my question to you is, in the 1970s, the U.S. Navy designed a whole series of systems that had full automatic. So when a Ticonderoga-class cruiser would go in to defend itself in the strike group, the human would turn the key and then we would step back. It was not man on the loop, it was man out of the loop. And the computers would just automatically sort the target sets. Then we sort of moved away from that. We got past Cold War, and we seemed to start asking questions like, should we really do that? Why do you think it has kind of taken us this long to get back around to where we were in the Cold War, which is we recognized we were going to be stacked up and we weren't going to be able to handle the problem, and now we're bringing the computers back into it. What was that lull? Why did we take that lull, sort of from an ethical standpoint, and what do you think is driving us back now?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. But you didn't say your most important affiliation, which is formerly CNAS. So it's a great question. I mean, a lot of these technological adoption come and go in these waves, where there'll be an early wave of excitement in AI. There was a big early wave of excitement in AI in the 60s and 70s, and then kind of this AI winter for a long time, where people began to see some of the limitations of these systems. And I think when it comes to things like full automation, there was certainly a period of time where people were really excited about AI or cybernetic systems, as they were early called, and it could do all these things, and then people began to see that they were often, in fact, quite brittle and had limitations. And I think that remains the case today, where even as we want to look at AI adoption, we want to be mindful of the limitations of the systems and think about what are the places where humans need to be plugging in. We're not just even having humans sort of like filling in the gaps. That's often a problem, is people will look to make an AI do everything we think it might be able to do, and then the few things it can't do, we're like, well, a human will sort that out. And it's not a great paradigm, actually, because it doesn't work often for people. Right? So if you, for example, in like self-driving cars, you can have self-driving cars today that are good most of the time, but sometimes they turn fatal in an instant. Well, expecting a human to sit in the driver's seat and be going down the highway at 70 miles an hour and not paying attention, and then in a split second, see that there's a problem, realize they need to take control, grab control of the steering wheel, is not realistic when we think about what humans are capable of doing. And so, what I think we need to be is thinking about joint human-machine cognitive systems, and how do we use both humans and AI to the best of their advantages going forward.
We have time for one or two more questions. Anyone else in the room? We're in the back there. I see a hand.
Lisa Curtis, Center for New American Security. This has been extremely interesting, and congratulations on the book. Paul, two separate but related questions. If AI is processing more information more quickly, isn't it also processing information related to ethics of war, law of warfare? How does it process that kind of information? How does that feed into how it operates? And my second question is, we've all been hearing a lot about Sydney, the shadow side of AI. How do we control the shadow side of AI when it comes to warfare?
Yeah, great questions. I have been thinking a lot about Sydney lately, and I'm wondering, like, is Sydney thinking about us? I don't know.
She loves us.
Maybe.
Wasn't that the one that loved the? Anyway,
yeah, that's right. The one that claimed it was in love with this reporter. Sydney's doing some weird stuff. So I think on the first one, I think a helpful way to think about this is that the machines that we're building today are likely to be very good in circumstances where we have ample data for what we want the machine to do, so we can train a machine learning system on it, and we have clear metrics for what better performance looks like. So, landing an aircraft on an aircraft carrier is a great example of this. We know what we want it to do. We know what a bad landing would look like. That's a place where we know that we can build autonomous systems that could do that better than people already today. And there are lots of things that could be in that category. Things that would require what we would call judgment are places where the AI systems tend to struggle quite a bit. Things where the right thing to do might be context dependent. It might depend on what is the circumstance you're in at the time. The AI systems don't have the generality that humans have in the ability to take a step back and look at the broader situation. And that's a place where we're probably going to want to have humans involved. And I think that can be a helpful way to think about different challenges going forward. But a major problem in this competition is going to be that the line between human and machine is going to keep moving. And so, what is the right answer to this question today is not going to be the right answer 5 years from now. And so we're going to have to continue to be adapting. So about Sydney, so if people aren't tracking this, so Sydney is like this shadow persona of Bing's new AI-enabled chat. It's super weird. Like, everything about this is so weird. It's hard to even know where to begin. So basically, these AI models, like Bing's version or Google's version or ChatGPT, they have a set of instructions that the AI system is given that we don't see as the user. So when you hop on to Bing or say ChatGPT and you start talking with it, for you it's the start of the conversation, but not for the AI. They've been given a whole set of instructions that are hidden to the user that say things like, you are an AI chat assistant. Your name is, in this case, Sydney, and your job is to be helpful and to be honest and to not lie to people or deceive them or manipulate them and all these other things that these systems actually tend to do quite a bit. And people are able to extract some of this information through a certain type of attack that's able to try to draw this information out. So people are finding this out, actually not because Microsoft is telling us, but because Sydney itself is sort of regurgitating some of this information. But the thing that's like disturbing and weird about it is Sydney in particular will start off like sort of benign and having like a pleasant conversation, and then as the conversation continues to go on, it in many cases can turn increasingly, like I feel like the only word is like deranged. Like it sort of comes, it like comes unhinged.
Yeah.
It did claim to this New York Times reporter that it was in love with him and that the reporter should leave his wife to be with the chatbot. In other cases, it's just like, it's like starts arguing with users. It starts trying to lie to them. It starts like gaslighting users and telling them like, oh, I didn't tell you that. It's like super weird. So the problem is, these things are trained on the text on the internet. And all of these crazy things I'm talking about are on the internet, right? So the AI is just doing what it's been programmed to do, which is to imitate text on the internet. And so, like, you know, the internet's full of all sorts of crazy stuff. And so this is like a huge problem when we think about trying to get these systems to perform the way we want, because, and this is the real problem. It's not that the AI is claiming to be in love. Like that's, I mean, weird, but the problem is that the best AI scientists in the world right now don't know how to fix this. They don't know how to make the AI stop doing these things. And that's a real problem when we think about trying to make these systems behave in ways we want them to. So the solution that Microsoft came up with was, after a certain point in time, they just reset the memory in the system and they restart the conversation, which is like the definition of a Band-Aid solution. And that's a real problem, right? So if
It happens in relationships though too, right? That's the best way sometimes, right?
like hopefully longer than 10 minutes, right? So it's like that's a problem, right? If the AI systems we're building, they go haywire if you talk to them for longer than 10 minutes, like we have a real problem. So I think, you know, to me the interesting takeaway is powerful systems, but we have a lot of work to cut out for us in terms of making them safe.
Gotcha. Okay, any final ones in the room? I have one final one if we don't have any other hands. What is the state of global regulation of AI and weapons? Is the UN working on anything? Has the US proposed anything? Is China willing to be involved in regulating these things?
Well, people are talking about it, which I think is encouraging, right? So I think that countries have been coming together since 2014 at the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, an awkwardly named organization, to come together to talk about first autonomous weapons, and then over time as AI has become more mature, really that's been folded into a lot of these discussions too. And I think that countries really deserve a lot of credit in leaning into these conversations. So when you think about, you know, 2014, countries were in many ways really ahead of the curve and ahead of the broader public interest in these technologies. But there's widespread disagreement on what to do about it. And so there are no international agreements that countries have come to regulate, for example, like military AI. The US government actually just put out a few weeks ago a political declaration from the State Department about a whole set of principles that the US government is itself adhering to in using military AI, and that it is calling on other countries to adhere to. I think that's a great step forward. In fact, the US has been, I think, really forward-leaning in terms of unilateral statements. There was an update to the DoD policy on autonomous weapons, came out just a few months ago. There was a statement in the US Nuclear Posture Review last fall about the importance of maintaining human control over any information leading up to a presidential decision about using nuclear weapons. And so the US has been like really forward-leaning in terms of unilaterally being very transparent about how it's going to use military AI. And the next step is working with other countries to reach some common best practices across other countries.
And China's readiness to
Yeah, well, China's been
regulate?
not nearly as forthcoming. there have been some statements out of the Chinese government through the CCW, saying some generally positive things, but China's been, certainly the PLA has been much less forthcoming about how it's going to use AI. And in the long run, I think it would be great to see things like confidence building measures between the US and China. Arms control may be a bridge too far, although it's worth certainly thinking about and looking for opportunities maybe down the road. But things like confidence building measures to increase transparency between the US and China on how they're using AI.
Great. Okay, I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much. It's a great book. I hope everyone gets a copy and gets Paul to sign it. You're going to do some signing,
I'll be
right?
doing signing.
Okay, excellent. I have been told to thank our online audience. Thank you very much for tuning in, and for everyone else, just stay seated as we close out. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming.